Welcome to the Safely Fermenting Food at Home webinar. My name is Suzanne Dreesen, and I'm a food safety extension educator with the University of Minnesota Extension. I'd like to welcome you today. I started preserving food when I was about 8 years old. I grew up in a small town in southwest Minnesota. We actually lived on a farm and had a large garden. In the summer, I felt like I was working in a small on-farm food processing factory. There was 11 kids in our family, and we were busy. We preserved everything. Cabbage was turned into sauerkraut and cucumbers into crop fermented pickles. Yum, yum. This is my last of 7 webinars that I did this summer and early fall on home food preservation. Topics of earlier webinars include freezing, canning, pickling, preserving tomatoes, and drying. All of these webinars are recorded and are posted on our UMN Extension Food Safety YouTube channel. So check those out, as I do cover a lot of information, a lot behind the science of why you need to preserve food the way you need to preserve it to keep it safe and tasty, of course. My training goal today is to provide you with the science and procedures to preserve food safely by fermenting. Today, I will provide you an overview of fermentation and how it preserves food, along with food safety considerations to make a safe product and prevent foodborne botulism. I will cover types of fermentation methods, but will focus on the lacto fermentation, as it is the most common method used. We will spend some time on how to monitor ferments and how to troubleshoot what is normal and what isn't. I will end with resources for you to access for safe methods and recipes. Fermenting food is becoming very popular. Although home food preservation and fermentation has been practiced for centuries around the world, fermentation is used as a way to preserve food. It's a process of converting food's carbohydrates into acid, carbon dioxide, and/or alcohol, which preserves food and extends the shelf life. Fermentation changes the flavor of the raw ingredients. Usually a tart and tangy flavor is developed. Through the fermentation process, some nutritional benefits of fermented foods do change as well. It increases the availability of vitamins and minerals for our bodies to absorb. Some of the sugars and starches in food are broken down through the process, making fermented foods easier to digest. Fermented foods are rich in probiotic bacteria and enzymes, increasing the health of your digestive system and enhancing the immune system. Lactic acid fermentation, known as lactofermentation, spontaneous, natural, or wild fermentation, or some other names it's given. Lacto refers to the bacteria, lactobacillus, natural fermenting microorganisms on the ingredients which provide the natural growth of fermenting organisms. During the lactofermentation process, the bacteria converts sugars into lactic acid or acetic acid, which preserves and inhibits growth of harmful bacteria. The lactofermentation process is used to produce ferments like sauerkraut, vegetables, fruit, and vinegar. Vinegar and fruit byproduct is acetic acid. Lactofermentation can be the most unpredictable method, but develops the most complex flavors since more fermenters are present on the ingredients. Culture inoculation is the opposite of wild fermentation. Cultured organisms such as bacteria, yeast, mold are introduced from an exterior source. This source can be store-bought or taken from a previous batch of the desired fermented foods such as kombucha, vegetables, beer, wine, and bread. The ingredients are heat treated before inoculation to ensure only starter culture bacteria are present and growing. Be sure to follow the directions accompanying the culture. Culture inoculation may result in less complex flavors, especially if the culture contains only a few fermenters. Is it safe? Food fermentation is safe to practice at home. As with any food preservation or food preparation method, it is essential that it is done safely. Following a tested recipe is the safest way to ferment foods. To prevent contamination by spoilage or harmful microorganisms, clean everything that you're going to use, including your hands, produce, any cutting or preparation utensils, surfaces where the food will be cut or chopped, and any containers you are going to use. Containers and other equipment should be washed in hot, soapy water before using. Do not use chlorine bleach to sanitize the equipment, as the remaining chlorine and chloramine residues on the equipment could inhibit the growth of fermenting organisms. If you do use chlorine, rinse equipment thoroughly with running water to remove any residual chemical. So some questions that came up when people registered for the webinar, one of them is, what's the difference between a pickled and fermented vegetables? Pickles, like the ones you buy in the supermarket, are fresh packed and home canned, are preserved in acetic brine, typically vinegar. The vinegar used in the product of fermentation, but the pickles themselves are not fermented and do not offer the same health benefits of fermented vegetables. What is backslopping? In backslopping, you add live bacteria from a fermented product to start other batches. In backslopping, the initial fermentation stage is shortened since fermenting microorganisms are already growing and the risk of fermentation failure is lower. This is commonly how sourdough, bread, yogurt, and other dairy ferments are made. The downside of backslopping is the natural sequence of fermentation is disrupted and flavors may not be as complex. In addition, the acidity level of the backslop can affect the process. And this leads to poor fermentation or a softer textured product. What is SCOBY? SCOBY is the acronym for symbiotic colony of bacteria and yeast. It is produced using a starter culture of bacteria and yeast. A mature SCOBY for kombucha resembles a flat jelly-like pancake, often referred to as a mushroom or tea fungus. Kefir, a fermented milk beverage, is started from a SCOBY. Rubbery blobs, known as kefir grains, are strained out after fermentation and then used to start the next batch. Let's look at the most common fermentation method of lactofermentation. The bacterial cultures needed for fermentation are present on the raw ingredients, so a starter culture is unnecessary. Lactobacillus bacteria, naturally found on plants, breaks down carbohydrates, the sugar, and starches to produce a byproduct of lactic or acetic acid, which lowers the pH, so harmful bacteria can't grow. Almost any fruit and vegetable may be fermented, but good fermenters are apples, beets, cabbage, carrots, daikon radishes, turnips, parsnips, cucumbers, okra, string beans, and tomatoes, which produce unique textures and flavors of vegetables beyond the traditional fermented sauerkraut or pickles. Leafy greens like kale has a strong taste after fermenting due to the chlorophyll content, so therefore it's not a good product to ferment. Your ferment will only be as good as the ingredients you use, So choose fresh, healthy produce, undamaged, uniformly sized, and at peak ripeness. Damaged areas on produce may contain bacteria, yeast, or mold contamination, which can affect the fermentation process and quality of the product. Wash produce, but do not scrub with a produce brush. Scrubbing can remove the lactobacillus bacteria organisms needed to start the fermentation process. Grate, chop, or shred dense vegetables like carrots, cabbage, and beets in uniform sizes to allow lactic acid to penetrate and convert sugars to lactic acid. Food safety is important to produce a safe and flavorful fermented vegetable product. Disease-causing E. coli, Salmonella, and Listeria monocytogenes are reasonably likely to be found on raw produce and must be controlled early in the fermentation process through proper salt concentration, time, temperature, and pH. The goal is to transform low-acid vegetables into an acidic food by reducing the pH to 4.6 or below and halt the growth of harmful microorganisms. To make most lacto-fermented foods, salt is usually required in some amount. Salt contributes to the tart, tangy flavor, firm texture, and safety of the final product. Salt promotes the growth of lactic acid and inhibits growth of harmful and spoilage microorganisms. Salt concentration is very important in fermentation. Measure salt carefully and use the amount of salt indicated in the recipe. The salt in fermentation should contain no additives. Anti-caking additives and table salt will cause a cloudy brine. Iodine and iodized salt can cause browning of vegetables and slow fermentation. Impurities found in natural salts like rock or sea salt have impurities and can affect the fermentation process. Lime impurities can reduce the acidity and the safety of the final product. Iron impurities can blacken the vegetables. Magnesium impurities can cause bitterness, while carbonates can result in softening, especially in pickles. Natural salts, flake salts, kosher salt, vary in weight and can alter the brine solution percentage, which can affect the safety and quality of the fermentation. Canning or pickling salt is recommended as it contains no impurities and has a consistent granular size and weight. Use the amount indicated in the recipe. Never alter recipe proportions. Do not use reduced sodium salt or reduce or omit salt. In some low salt fermentations, researchers observed a secondary fermentation in which lactic acid was metabolized, raising the pH to a dangerous level above 4.6. An alternative to salt is a starter culture. Some recipes call for fresh whey as a starter for the ferment. Follow manufacturer's directions for use. Methods to salt include dry or direct salting, brining, or a combination of dry salt and brining, such as in kimchi. The salting method will be indicated in your recipe. All methods draw the moisture from vegetables and fruits to create a brine. The brine attracts good bacteria and produces the acids that create an environment to prevent growth of harmful or spoilage microorganisms. The key to a successful ferment is to keep the vegetables and fruit completely submerged in the brine. Salt is added directly to the ingredients in the direct or dry salting method. After mixing in the salt, leave the mixture rest for 20 minutes to allow the natural juice extraction to form a brine. Massaging the vegetables helps to speed up the process and is a fantastic workout for your hand muscles. Chopping or shredding the vegetables also increase the speed of water release and allow for better fermentation initiation. The brine is used to cover the vegetables when packed into the fermentation container. M- Mixing salt and water to form brine before adding to the vegetables is called the brining method. Use soft or distilled water. Hard water may cause cloudiness in the brine and discolor your product. If only hard water is available, boil it and let it sit for 24 hours. Then skim off scum and use water from the top of the container without disturbing any sediment. Follow your recipe to mix the salt water mixture to prevent undesirable bacteria growth in the product you are fermenting. Generally, 5% salt concentrations are used for large vegetables like cucumbers and carrots. Add 3 tablespoons of salt, 1.6 or 45 grams to 1 quart of water. A 3% concentration is used for shredded vegetables like cabbage or kraut. Add 2 tablespoons of salt, 1 ounce or 27 grams of salt to 1 quart of water. It is best to weigh salt for accuracy. This technique is best for whole or quarter pieces to allow for better coverage of the vegetable, which lessens the risk of fermentation failure. If there isn't enough brine to cover the vegetables from dry salting, you may need to make additional brine according to these calculations. Many tested and proven recipes options do allow you to personalize your fermentation with spices and flavorings. There are recipes for sour pickles with dill, garlic, and pickling spices, sauerkraut with apples. The University of Illinois Extension has a golden sauerkraut recipe with fresh garlic, ginger, and turmeric. Spices should be fresh. Older dried spices have a higher chance of mold content, which when compared to fresh spice or newly dried spices. Whole spices are best. Ground and flaked dried spices can float to the top of the fermentation vessel and may mold over time. Powder spices may cause the darkening of the final product and a cloudy brine. Couple more questions. What do you do about salty sauerkraut? Again, do not alter or reduce the salt according to the recipe. Follow it exactly. But if you do find your sauerkraut is too salty for you, you can rinse it under running tap water or use the ingredients that need more salt. So put that sauerkraut in a hot dish, for example. The production process of safe fermented foods include proper containers and weights to keep produce submerged under brine to allow for growth of fermenting organisms. pH monitoring ensures a steady and sustained drop in the pH of the fermentation brine. A prescribed temperature and time to hold the ferment is needed for safety and quality. Choosing a container. A 1 gallon container is needed for each 5 pounds of food. Glass mason jars with bands and lids are gallon size resealable zipper plastic bags or a round slow cooker insert works well for small batches. For plastic containers, look for a high density polyethylene containers. HDPE number 2 plastics are best and are free to avoid leaching of chemicals into the ferment. When choosing a crock, it's important to ensure that the paint or glaze does not contain lead, especially in older crocks made before the 1970s. Lead from paint or glaze can leach into food, especially under the acidic conditions of fermentation. Do not use garbage bags, metal containers, or crocks with cracks or chips that could harbor pathogens. Pack container tightly, removing any air pockets. to 4 to 5 inches from the container rim. A fully packed container causes the brine to overflow and inhibits the fermentation process. Another important step of lactofermentation is to starve the food of oxygen. Lactofermentation is anaerobic, meaning the bacteria do not need or want oxygen to convert the sugars into lactic acid. Keeping the product under the level of brine is needed to ensure the harmful bacteria stay out so the good bacteria can flourish. Keeping oxygen out of the equation creates a safe haven for lactic acid bacteria to do their thing without interruption from molds and other undesirable microorganisms. A weight keeps food under the brine, and the food must be kept 1 to 2 inches under the brine while fermenting. If using a crock as your fermentation vessel, cover product with a plate or glass pie plate that is slightly smaller than the container opening. Then put a container filled with water as shown in the photo, or weigh it down with 2 or 3 quart jars filled with water and that are capped. Check it 2 to 3 times each week and remove scum if it forms. Alternatively, you can use gallon-sized plastic bags filled with brine of 1.5 tablespoons salt per quart of water to weigh and seal the container. Place the bag in the fermentation container to cover and hold down the food fermenting. Under brine, using brine prevents dilution in case the bag leaks. Newer products for fermenting are self-containing, while fermenting with a lid and spring for quart jars, there's glass weights, an airlock system are some of the newer systems out there. And then another thing that you'll do is actually you can weigh down the product and making sure that you're using food grade weights if you are using this crock type system. Do not use weights that are not intended for food, as they may contain harmful compounds such as lead. I know my mom used to use rocks to hold on her plate, but that's not really a good idea because rocks may contain heavy metals and limestone that can degrade under salty and acidic environments and can become part of the food, and contaminate your ferment. Cover containers with a towel or coffee filter secured with a rubber band to keep insects and airborne molds out while allowing gases to escape that develop during fermentation. Jars with airlock systems, as shown in the picture, works well to keep out oxygen and pests while allowing for off-gassing of carbon dioxide. Keep container in a dark place or cover a container with a dark towel. Exposure to light will kill the bacteria needed to ferment your product. Monitor your ferment. Check daily to make sure the vegetables remain submerged under the brine. And this is especially important during that first week. If the brine levels fall below the level of the product during the first week, dilute 1 tablespoon of salt in 2 cups of water and pour some of this brine over the product, just until it covers the mixture. Do not worry if the brine disappears after the 7 days. By then, you have created a safe environment and do not need to add more brine. During the first day or two, however, the mixture will start to get bubbly and the brine will rise and seep out. If the covering is bulging or you do not see brine seeping out, carefully loosen the lid just until you hear gases escape and see liquid seeping. If you use a tight fitting lid, remove the lid after a day or two to burp the jar and release the gases that have built up. Check it every few days to release the pressure from the gases. Dispose any floating pieces. Temperature and time are critical components of the fermentation process. Maintain required incubation temperature and time frame according to your recipe. According to Snyder and colleagues from the Food Protection Trends 2020, lightly fermented or under acidified vegetable products caused foodborne illness in multiple outbreaks. Most often implicated were under acidified vegetables and kimchi products. Proper temperature is important in making a fermented food. This is needed to allow the food to ferment well and to destroy any problem pathogens. Most products are fermented at temperatures between 70 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. In this temperature range, fermentation generally takes 3 to 4 weeks. At 60 degrees to 65 degrees, fermentation will proceed more slowly and may take 5 to 6 weeks. Fermentation at temperatures above 75 may result in spoilage. Use a thermometer to measure room and storage temperatures to monitor for proper fermentation. Store fermenting vegetables in a sealed container at 70 to 75 degrees, which that is the optimum temperature that we just talked about for fermenting microorganisms. Try not to disturb the vegetables during fermentation to reduce the amount of oxygen reaching the vegetables so that mold doesn't grow. The kimchi fermentation process is very short in comparison to making sauerkraut. Kimchi ferments at room temperatures in only 1 to 2 days and 3 to 4 days in the refrigerator. Fruit is fermented at cooler temperatures between 50 to 59 degrees and takes less time to ferment because of the natural sugar content. Ferment kombucha at 68 to 72 degrees, but do not ferment in the sun or outside where the temperatures can rise and be too high. Kombucha takes about 12 days to 1 month to ferment. An important key to the safety of fermented vegetables is a steady and sustained drop in the pH of the fermentation brine. Many foods start at a natural pH around 7.0. To prevent Staphylococcus aureus toxin formation, food must ferment to below a pH of 5.2 within the first 24 hours. Food should reach a pH of 4.6 or below within 48 hours to reduce growth of pathogenic bacteria and/or spoilage microorganisms. It may take longer depending on the vegetable matrix and temperature at which fermentation occurs. Following a tested recipe exactly increases the likelihood of success and reduces the chances that the pH may be off. When to test for pH? Take 2 to 3 brine samples from different areas of each fermentation vessel. Measure the pH of each sample. Generally, pH measurements are taken daily for the first several days. Use a properly calibrated pH meter according to the manufacturer's directions. Litmus paper may be used to monitor pH whenever the brine falls below 4.0. Once a safe pH of less than 4.6 is reached, continue to take weekly pH readings to verify the pH is not rising during the time frame needed for a fully flavorful fermented product. Most products develop full flavors at temperatures between 68 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit in 3 to 4 weeks, and at 60 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit in 5 to 6 weeks. Spoilage and rising pH is more common in no salt or low salt ferments and at temperatures above 75 degrees. Discard vegetable ferments that rise in pH. Again, kimchi ferments quicker than pickles or sauerkraut. So with kimchi, you want to test your pH every 12 hours for 2 days until pH is less than 4.6 at room temperature between 68 to 72 degrees, or every day for 4 days until the pH is less than 4.6 for fermentation under refrigeration at 40 degrees. As fermentation takes place, some changes may seem to be undesirable, but are actually a normal part of the process. Other changes are indeed undesirable and should be a cause for concern. We'll take a look at some of the most common changes that happen during fermentation. Scum on surface of the brine while curing is wild yeast and bacteria that feed on the acid produced and can reduce the salt concentration if allowed to accumulate. A white or pinkish film called cam yeast is very common on vegetables, but should be removed to avoid off flavors. Check daily and remove scum as needed. If the film is above the ferment over the weight, oxidized yeast will form vinegar and increase the risk of mold growth. Skim this off. Remove any scum that forms during fermentation by skimming the scum with a clean, non-metal spoon or cup. If sealed properly or using an airlock system, you do not have to skim the fine white film powder that forms on the surface. It is yeast and not harmful. The process works best in these systems when undisturbed. Both a cloudy brine or sediment means the vegetables are fermenting well. A cloudy brine is a sign that fermentation is taking place. A white sediment is a normal bacteria from fermentation. After 24 hours, there will be visible bubbles on the top of the brine and is due to carbon dioxide forming. Foaming is expected and normal, but it may not happen or even be noticeable as fermenting organisms will release carbon dioxide and create bubbling and fizzing. Small pieces of food may escape the weight and float to the top of the brine. Discard floaters as they may not be safe to consume because they were exposed to air. Mushy ferments are often an indication of improper fermentation due to a weak brine. Too high a temperature during fermentation, uneven salt distribution, or even air pockets. Mushiness is caused by spoilage microorganisms, but pathogenic or disease-causing microorganisms can also be present. It is best practice to discard mushy ferments. Slimy ferments are usually caused by fermenting at too high of temperatures, as spoilage microorganisms can outcompete the fermenters. Discard. Fermentation gives off odors and is normal, but if the smell is foul, this can indicate problems such as pathogenic and or spoilage microorganism growth. It is best practice to check the pH, and if it is off, discard. Fruit flies happen if the vessel is uncovered during the fermentation process. Insects lay eggs on the surface and hatch, which leads to and can cause physical contamination and off odors. Discard and start over. To prevent, cover the vessel with a lid or cheesecloth or coffee filter secured tightly with a rubber band. Mold is a sign that your container is not airtight. If you see mold, discard and start over, as spores can exist in the entire product. If you see a creamy film on top and smells yeasty, throw it out. Discard any slimy vegetables. Color changes are expected. Green cabbage may turn yellow or pinkish. If pickles are too dark, it may be due to hard water, which has a high mineral content. Using ground spices or leaving the whole spices in the fermenting container can also cause darkening. It is important to use a non-reactive metals when fermenting. The use of brass, iron, copper, or zinc containers will cause darkening due to their reactivity. Foods fermenting in these types of containers should not be eaten. If products become discarded or discolored, pink or dark, it should be discarded. This discoloration does indicate spoilage. As fermentation takes place, some changes may seem to be undesirable. And again, making sure that you're checking your ferment is important to monitor it throughout so that you can catch if something is going wrong early. So now we'll look at after your ferment is complete and fully flavored, how do you store it? So it's important when you are ready to store your product that you do handle your fermented product with clean hands and do not let them come in contact with the product itself. So use something to a clean tool, the utensil to transfer that. And then just remember that fermentation is not a sterilization method. So you would want to store by refrigerating, canning, or freezing your product. Again, depends on what product you made. Keep vegetables submerged under the brine during storage. Again, this is important to prevent softening of your product. So for kombucha, you will refrigerate to stop the alcohol production. Fermented pickles you can store by refrigerating or canning and boiling water for a longer shelf-stable storage. For canning fermented pickles, you can process pints for 15 minutes and quarts for 20 minutes in a water bath or boiling water canner. Kimchi, you'll store that refrigerated. And sauerkraut, you can keep in the fermentation vessel in a dark, cool area for 3 months. But again, make sure that your sauerkraut's submerged under your brine. And that's you can also do that for fermented pickles too. However, refrigeration storage is recommended. We refrigerate up to 4 months or freeze for 8 to 12 months, or process sauerkraut in a boiling water bath to keep it on your shelf. Process pints of unheated sauerkraut, which is called raw pack, for 25 minutes, or quarts for 30 minutes. Process pints of heated sauerkraut, called a hot pack, for 15 minutes, and for pints, and quarts for 20 minutes. That was a lot of information, so we're winding down now, and I'll share some resources for you to dig a little deeper and get started with your fermenting process. Again, a couple of resources that I will mention here is Sander Kotz. He does a lot of fermentations, kind of the guru of fermenting. He has a video series, 9-part video series tutorial that really walks you through the steps. You could search for that on YouTube. Another site I really like is culturesforhealth.com. It's a great resource, especially if you're interested in doing small batches, and they have many different products, recipes, and procedures on many, many different products. Colorado State Extension, on their Farm to Table website, they have recipes and instructions for kombucha and also kimchi. And North Carolina's Extension, that's a really good source for recipes and instructions for fermented yogurt, kimchi, pickles, sauerkraut. And search Safe Plates, North Carolina, to find their resources. The National Center for Home Food Preservation website is a great resource for how-to guides on preserving food by fermenting. So how do I ferment? National Center for Home Food Preservation website. They do USDA, research for USDA, and so they have research tested recipes on dill pickles and sauerkraut. And then they also talk about troubleshooting and just the whole process of fermenting. You can call our extension answer line and talk directly to an extension professional that's staffed so if you want to talk to somebody and get talk through your process, call our extension answer line at 1-800-854-1678. That's a Monday through Friday service, but you can leave a voicemail. Minnesota, that's for Minnesota callers, and Iowa callers have their own phone number, so you can find that on the answer line website. You can also email your questions to answer at iastate.edu, and I also would encourage you to visit their website because they do have a food preservation FAQ resource that has a lot of great answers to commonly asked questions. And one more thing I like about Answer Mine is that they do have a blog that you can subscribe to, and it's very timely on seasonal updates. You can also call the answer line with other food safety questions, any food preservation method, and any other household related concerns, like if you have a stain in your carpet that you can't get out, or you have mold that you want to get rid of. So they'll help you with all the household questions. And then the University of Minnesota, you can learn more on our extension website. And we have a preserving and preparing page, so check that out. We have mini videos on 21 food preservation topics you'll find on that page. We also have several videos posted on our YouTube channel, including the recordings of these webinars. So look for that on the preserving playlist. And then if you're on Twitter, follow us at UMN Food Safety, as many of our posts are food preservation related. And I'll end just with a few more questions that people that registered had. And one is about learning more about small batch fermenting. And there are several resources that I have there. Again, the Culture for Health and freshpreserving.com has some small batch recipes as well. So I checked those out. Let's see. I was looking at freshpreserving.com. They have recipes for quart jars of sauerkraut, kimchi, fermented jalapeno hot sauce, fermented jelly beans, fermented India relish, fermented easy brine cucumber pickles, fermented tomato salsa. So that's a great one as well. And someone asked about fridge fermenting. Is that a thing? So you usually want to allow the vegetables to fully ferment at room temperature before transferring to the refrigerator. The extreme cold of refrigeration will really slow or can halt the fermentation process entirely. But however, there are methods to ferment different products like kimchi. You can refrigerate and ferment in the refrigerator at 40 degrees for 3 to 4 days. Or you can, so that's an option. The other option for kimchi is to ferment it at room temperature for 1 to 2 days and then put it in the refrigerator. So I hope you learned some things today about fermenting, especially the science and the whys behind fermenting. That's really what we do in Extension, is to give you the reasons why things need to be done so that your product is safe. And I'll let you go and do the magic. So happy fermenting.